The text came through while the seamstress was still pinning the back of the dress. 4 lines. No call. No warning. I can't do this. I'm sorry. Don't wait for me at the altar. Venus Kane read it twice, standing in front of a mirror inside a stone chapel outside Barcelona, in a dress that cost more than her first car. Surrounded by white flowers she picked out herself 3 months ago, because nobody else was going to do it for her. She read it a third time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. Her best friend Talia was mid-sentence about something funny that happened at the rehearsal dinner when she noticed Venus had stopped laughing. What? Venus turned the phone around and let her read it. Talia's face did 3 things in 2 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, rage. He sent that by text? Today? While you're standing here in the dress he picked the wedding date around. Venus didn't answer right away. She was doing the thing she always did when something hit too hard too fast. She went quiet. And inside that quiet, she was running calculations. How long had he known? Who else knew? Was the food already paid for? Was her mother already seated? Was this real? Or was this some kind of cruel joke? That Garrison Voss, a grown man with a law degree and a trust fund, would somehow think was funny. It wasn't a joke. She knew that the second she saw his name on the screen, without a single phone call attached to it. She laughed first. It came out short and sharp, the kind of laugh that's one breath away from something else entirely. He couldn't even call me, she said. 3 months of planning, and he couldn't pick up a phone. That was the moment everything in her chest went still and loud at the same time. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting Venus right now, do me a favor and drop a like, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss out on stories like this. And trust me, you want to be here for all of it. Venus didn't cry in front of the seamstress. She didn't cry in front of Talia either. Not really. Not the kind of crying that needs witnesses. She asked for 5 minutes alone, and when she got them, she sat on a wooden bench in the back room of the chapel, in a dress she'd never wear again, and let herself feel exactly what she needed to feel, for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she stood up, because somebody had to figure out what came next, and that somebody was always going to be her. Nobody told her where her regular clothes were packed. The bags had already been moved to the reception hall for the after-party, and Venus didn't have it in her to walk through a building full of flowers and string lights meant for a wedding that wasn't happening anymore. So she walked out the side door in the dress, veil still pinned, makeup holding on by pure stubbornness, and got into the first car waiting at the curb. She didn't check who it belonged to, she just needed to be moving. The driver pulled off before either of them said a word, which suited Venus fine, because she didn't have any words left to give anyone. She stared out the window at the dry hills outside the city, at the cypress trees lining the road, and let her mind go as blank as it could manage. It took almost 10 minutes before the man beside her, because there was a man beside her, she realized, sitting close enough that she should have noticed sooner, finally spoke. "You're not my driver's other client," he said. His English had a clean, careful edge to it, the kind that comes from someone who learned it well and uses it deliberately. Venus turned and actually looked at him for the first time. Dark suit, no tie, like he'd pulled it off in a hurry. Korean, maybe early 30s, jaw tight, like he was holding something in. "And you're not my Uber," she said. It wasn't even that funny, but something about the absurdity of it, a woman in a full wedding dress, correcting a stranger's assumption from the back of a car, neither of them was supposed to be sharing, cracked something open in both of them at the same time. He almost smiled, she almost did too. The actual driver, a heavy-set man named Paul, who'd been hired by the venue's events company, realized the mistake 2 blocks later when his radio started buzzing with confused calls from 2 different directions and pulled over to sort it out. By then, neither Venus nor the man beside her had asked the other to leave. "I was supposed to be married 4 hours ago," Venus said, mostly to fill the silence. Mostly because saying it out loud to a stranger felt safer than saying it to anyone who actually knew her. "I was supposed to be engaged 4 hours ago," he said back. They sat with that for a second. Then, They were both laughing, not loud, not long, but real, at the sheer ridiculousness of two people in their best clothes, hiding in the back of a stranger's car on the worst afternoon of their lives. His name was Seo Jun-chul. He didn't offer it right away. He gave it to her almost an hour later, in a small cafe near the edge of the old town. After Venus had ordered a coffee she had no intention of drinking, and he'd ordered the same thing without explanation. They didn't talk about why they were both running. Not yet. They talked about nothing. The heat, the traffic, a stray cat that kept circling their table like it had business with them specifically. Venus didn't ask for his number. She wasn't about to be anybody's rebound. Not today. Not after everything. He didn't ask for hers either, though something in the way he kept glancing at her said he wanted to. When they finally parted outside the cafe, the sun dropping low over the rooftops, Venus walked away in a wedding dress she still hadn't changed out of, and she didn't look back once. But she thought about him, the whole walk to Talia's borrowed car, and she hated that she did. A week passed. Venus didn't fall apart, because falling apart wasn't something she allowed herself to do for longer than a weekend, especially not over a man who couldn't even end things with his voice instead of his thumbs. But she threw herself into the one thing that had never once let her down: work. Venus ran a small but growing catering business out of Barcelona, the kind that started as private dinner parties for homesick expats craving food that tasted like home, and grew, slowly, into something real. She built it from nothing after moving to Spain 3 years earlier, chasing a relationship that had just ended in the cruelest possible way, and she wasn't about to let one bad text undo years of work. So when her business partner called with news of a potential contract, a Korean shipping and logistics company expanding into Barcelona, looking for someone to handle private dinners for their executive team during a sensitive negotiation period, Venus said yes before she even asked what the pay was. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in a glass-walled office overlooking the port. Venus walked in with her portfolio, her sample menu, and the kind of confidence she'd rebuilt brick by brick over the last 7 days. She walked out of the elevator, turned the corner into the conference room, and stopped mid-step. Seo Jun-chul was sitting at the head of the table. For a second, neither of them said anything. The assistant who'd led Venus in glanced between them, confused by the silence. "You're the client," Venus said, because someone had to say something. "You're the caterer," Jun-chul said back, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite surprise, more like relief, dressed up as composure. The meeting went forward like two professionals who hadn't shared a coffee and a wedding dress a week earlier. Venus pitched her menu. Jun-chul asked sharp questions about sourcing and dietary restrictions for visiting investors, and Venus answered every single one without missing a beat, because she knew her business better than anyone in that room. By the end of it, she had the contract. She also had his number, finally, because business required it. The weeks that followed built slowly, the way real things tend to build when nobody's rushing them. Jun-chul showed up unannounced to one of Venus's smaller pop-up dinners on a Thursday night, sleeves rolled up, and when her line cook called in sick at the worst possible moment, he was the one who ended up washing dishes in the back without being asked, jacket draped over a chair, laughing at himself the whole time for how bad he was at it. "You're going to break that plate," Venus told him, watching him scrub a pan like it owed him money. "I'm a fast learner," he said. "You're a billionaire. You don't have to learn this." "Maybe I want to." She caught him another night, working late in his office, eating cold paella straight out of a container because he hadn't stopped to eat all day. Nobody else on his team had noticed. Venus did, because noticing things about people was something she'd always been good at, and she sat across from him without being invited and started talking about nothing in particular until he laughed for the first time in hours. The calls started after that. Business at first, always business at first, and then somehow 40 minutes later, they'd be talking about his father's expectations or her mother's worry that she'd never settle down. Two people circling something neither one wanted to name yet. He was funny in a way she hadn't expected. Dry, understated, the kind of humor that crept up on you instead of announcing itself. She was sharper than anyone he'd worked with in years, correcting his investors' wine pairings without flinching, calling him out, the one time he tried to talk to her like an employee instead of an equal. "Don't do that," she told him flatly, the first time he slipped into giving orders instead of asking. "Do what?" "That voice. The one you use on people who work for you." "I don't work for you. I work with you," he apologized. He meant it. That was the difference. And she noticed that too. Underneath all of it, a question sat quiet and unanswered in the back of Venus's mind. Why a stranger's car had been the one waiting at that curb on the worst day of her life. And why it had felt, even then, like something more than bad luck. She didn't know yet how right she was to wonder. Garrison Voss hadn't left her for someone else. He'd left because 2 days before the wedding, his mother, Lenora, discovered something in old paperwork that made the marriage a liability instead of a milestone. Something tied to land Venus didn't even know she owned, a property outside Barcelona, left to her by a father she barely remembered, a man who died when she was 12, and whose name she rarely said out loud anymore. Venus knew none of this yet. All she knew was that her mother had once mentioned, years ago, that her father left behind some land in Spain that wasn't worth the paperwork it would take to claim it. She'd never chased it. She had no reason to. That was about to change. The first real crack in Venus's defenses came on a night that started ordinary and ended somewhere else entirely. Jun Chul invited her to dinner. Not a work dinner, not a pretend one either, just dinner, at a small place near the water that didn't have his name attached to it anywhere. He showed up without his usual driver, which Venus noticed immediately, because she noticed everything. "No security tonight?" she asked. "I gave him the night off," Jun Chul said. "I wanted one night where nobody's watching." They talked for almost 3 hours. About his childhood in Seoul, about a father who measured love in contracts and quarterly numbers, about a mother who died when he was 19, and how nobody in his family had properly grieved her because grieving wasn't efficient. Venus talked about her father, the little she remembered, a laugh that filled up a whole room, a man who used to carry her on his shoulders through a market she couldn't even name anymore, and how losing him at 12 had taught her early that nothing in life stayed soft for long if you didn't fight to keep it that way. "You're not scared of anything," Jun Chul said, watching her across the table. "I'm scared of plenty," Venus said. "I just don't let it drive." Walking back along the water afterward, he reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and neither of them said anything about what that meant. They didn't have to. The trouble started 2 weeks later, with a phone call Jun Chul wasn't supposed to overhear. His father, Seo Hyun-tae, had paused, not cancelled, the merger engagement to Yu Ra-mi, paused it as leverage while negotiating better terms with her family's steel conglomerate. Jun Chul found out he was still, on paper, contractually tied to an arrangement he'd thought was dead, the same week he stood in that chapel, waiting for it to be over. His signature was already on documents he didn't remember being told to sign, buried inside language about preliminary terms that his father's lawyers had slipped past him during a stretch of mergers paperwork he'd been too distracted to read carefully. He told Venus the truth the same night he found out, because he wasn't the kind of man who let things rot in silence, no matter how much it cost him. "I'm still tied to it," he said. "On paper, I didn't agree to this version of it, but it's there." Venus sat across from him in his apartment, arms crossed, jaw tight, doing the math she always did when something threatened to take from her what she'd only just let herself want. "So you're engaged," she said, still. "Not in any way that means anything to me." "That's not what I asked." He didn't have an easy answer, because there wasn't one. Venus left that night without slamming the door, which somehow felt worse than if she had. 3 days later, she finally went to see the land her father left her, Something she'd been putting off for years. Something she only chased now, because Talia kept pushing her to deal with the paperwork before the city reassessed the property taxes again. She drove out past the edges of the city with a folder of documents she barely understood, expecting overgrown nothing. She found a half-renovated vineyard instead. New fencing, repaired stonework. Someone had been maintaining the land, quietly, consistently, for years, without her permission and without her knowledge. It took her 2 phone calls and one furious afternoon at a local property office to find out who'd been paying for it. A subsidiary of the Seo family's holding company. Venus sat in her car outside that vineyard for a long time before she called Jun Chul, and when she finally did, her voice was flat, in the way it only got when she was holding something back by force. "Did you know," she said, "about my father's land? Did you know your family's been sitting on it for years?" The silence on the other end told her everything before he said a word. "I didn't know it was yours," he said. "Finally, I swear to you, Venus, I didn't know." "But your family's been keeping it," she said. "Why would they do that unless it mattered to them?" He didn't have an answer for that either, because the truth was uglier than either of them wanted it to be. His father had been keeping the land warm, waiting for the moment it became useful, never imagining his own son would fall for the one woman holding the deed that mattered most. Venus hung up before he could say anything else. She didn't cry in the car. She'd promised herself, somewhere around the time her wedding fell apart by text message, that crying alone in cars wasn't a habit she was going to keep. But she sat there a long time, hands on the wheel, feeling like the ground underneath her had quietly shifted without asking permission, the same way it had the day Garrison's text came through. She was starting to wonder if she was ever going to be the one in control of her own life, or if she was always going to be the last person told what was actually happening to her. Lenora Voss didn't wait for Venus to recover before she made her next move. Venus found out from her own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ines, she'd hired the moment the vineyard's history started getting complicated, that someone had filed a legal challenge against her father's old probate case, claiming irregularities in the original transfer of the land. The filing came through a small legal office in Barcelona that, after 20 minutes of digging, turned out to be retained by the Voss family's European holdings. "They're betting you won't have the money or the time to fight this properly," Ines told her, over the phone. "It's not really about winning the case. It's about making you give up before it gets that far." Venus sat in her kitchen that night, staring at a stack of documents she barely understood the language of, feeling something she hated feeling. Outmatched. Not unintelligent. Outmatched. By people with more lawyers and more money, and absolutely nothing to lose by spending both. She didn't call Jun Chul. Not because she didn't want to, but because some stubborn part of her needed to know she could survive this without leaning on the one person whose family had a hand in it, even if his hand had been clean. 3 days of silence between them stretched into 5. Jun Chul didn't chase her, which surprised her more than if he had, until she found out why. He'd spent those 5 days going through every piece of paperwork his father's company had ever filed, connected to that land, building a case of his own, quietly, without telling her, because some part of him understood that showing up with proof would mean more than showing up with apologies. He finally called her on the 6th day. "I need you to see something," he said, not over the phone. She almost said no. She said yes instead, because some part of her, the same part that got into the wrong car a month ago, instead of waiting for the right one, had never been very good at walking away from things worth fighting for, even when fighting scared her more than losing. He showed her documents that night that confirmed what neither of them wanted confirmed. His father had known about the land's connection to Venus's father for years, long before the wedding, long before the wrong car. He'd been keeping it in reserve, the same way you keep any asset in reserve, waiting to see what it might be worth someday. "He used me to get close to it," Venus said quietly. "Even before I knew you. Even before any of this. He didn't plan for me to fall in love with you," Jun Chul said. That part was never part of any plan he made. That part is just us. Venus wanted to believe him. The problem was that wanting to believe something and actually believing it were two very different muscles, and hers had taken a beating over the last month that hadn't fully healed. I need time, she told him. Not because of you. Because I don't trust anything that's happened to me in the last 6 weeks, including this. He didn't argue. He just nodded, jaw tight, and let her walk out of the apartment without following her, which was the hardest thing he'd done since the day he climbed into the wrong car at that chapel. The threat didn't slow down just because the romance had. Lenora Voss's legal team pushed the probate case forward, filing motions that Ines had to scramble to answer, each one costing money Venus didn't have lying around. Garrison started calling, first to check in, then to apologize in a roundabout way that mostly served to remind Venus how much she didn't miss him, and finally, drunk one night, to say something that almost slipped past her before she caught it. My mother's been planning this for years, he said, voice thick and uneven. The wedding, the land, all of it. I just got caught in the middle. What do you mean, planning it for years? Venus said, suddenly very still. He didn't answer clearly. He just mumbled something about needing to go, and hung up, leaving Venus with more questions than she'd had before he called. She brought what she had to Jun-chul 2 days later, not because she'd forgiven him, but because the fight in front of them had stopped being about the two of them, and started being bigger than either of them could win alone. There's a dinner, Jun-chul told her. My father's hosting it. The merger signing with Rami's family. Lenora will be there too. She's been quietly involved in negotiating something on the side, a separate land transaction tied to the same deal. You think they're going to finalize something at that dinner, about my land? I think if we don't show up with everything we have, they will. Venus looked at him for a long moment, weighing every reason she had to walk away clean, and every reason she had to stay and finish what had started the day a stranger's car pulled up at the wrong curb. Fine, she said, but I'm not walking into that room as anybody's +1. I walk in as myself, or I don't walk in at all. That's the only way I'd want you there, Jun-chul said. The dinner was held in a private hall attached to the Ciso family's Barcelona offices, the kind of room built specifically to impress people into agreeing with things they hadn't fully read. Long table, low lighting, a string quartet nobody was really listening to, investors from both sides, lawyers stationed along the walls like furniture, CEO Hyuntae at the head of the table, composed in the particular way of a man who'd never once in his life had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Venus walked in wearing a dark green dress she'd chosen specifically because it made her feel like herself, hair done the way she liked it, not the way anyone expected a guest at this kind of dinner to look. Jun-chul met her at the door, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know about how much it meant that she'd shown up at all. Rami found Venus before the meal started, pulling her aside near a window overlooking the harbor. I know what this dinner is supposed to do, Rami said, her English precise, careful. I want you to know something before it happens. I never wanted this engagement. Not the first time, not this version of it either. I've been seeing someone in Seoul for 2 years. My father doesn't know. I have no interest in marrying Jun-chul. And I have every interest in this merger, collapsing in a way that doesn't drag my name through it. Venus studied her for a second, deciding whether to trust a stranger who had every reason to be an enemy, and apparently wasn't one. Why are you telling me this? Venus said. Rami handed her a folder, thin, unmarked. Because inside this is everything I've quietly collected on Lenora Voss, forging land transfer signatures going back 9 years, including one bearing your father's name, dated after he died. Venus's hands went still around the folder. After he died. 9 years ago, Rami said. She's been doing this longer than you've probably been an adult. Venus didn't have time to process the full weight of that before dinner was called to order, and the room settled into the kind of polite tension that precedes very impolite conversations. The meal moved through its early courses with the usual hollow pleasantries, toasts about partnership, vague language about shared futures that meant nothing and everything at once. Lenora Voss sat near the head of the table, composed, dressed like money that had never once been questioned, sipping wine like she already knew how the night would end. It was Jun Chul who broke the rhythm first. He stood, not dramatically, just with the quiet certainty of a man who'd spent 5 days building a case instead of an apology. "Before we move into the formal signing," he said, "there's something the room should see." His father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Jun Chul." "This won't take long," Jun Chul said, and laid out, point by point, calm and exact, everything he'd found. The land his father's company had been quietly maintaining for years, the connection to Venus's father's original deed, and the fraud Rami's folder had just confirmed in writing. The room went very still. Lenora's composure cracked first at the edges, a tightening around her eyes that no amount of money had ever taught her to hide completely. That was when the door at the back of the hall opened, and Garrison Voss walked in, clearly several drinks deep, clearly not invited, clearly under the impression that showing up uninvited and slightly drunk to his mother's biggest business dinner was somehow going to fix something. "Venus," he said, too loud for the room. "I came to fix this. I know what my mother did. I know it was wrong. I should have." "Garrison," Lenora said sharply, but it was too late. "She told me to call off the wedding, because of the land," Garrison said, the words tumbling out of him in the particular honesty that only shows up after enough wine. "She said if we got married, it would all come out in the paperwork eventually. I didn't want to do it. I swear I didn't want to do it." The room absorbed that confession in complete silence. Garrison had meant it to make him look like a victim. Instead, in front of every lawyer, every investor, every person whose attention mattered in that room, he'd just handed Venus the one thing she needed most, a public admission, on record, from the man at the center of the lie. Venus stood up slowly. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I want to thank Garrison," Venus said, "for finally saying out loud what his mother's been hiding for 9 years." A few of the investors shifted in their seats. Lenora's face had gone the color of old paper. "My father died when I was 12, Venus continued, steady, unhurried. "He left me land outside this city that I didn't even know existed until a month ago. I found out it had been quietly maintained for years by a company connected to this family." She nodded toward the head of the table without flinching. "I found out, tonight, that signatures were forged on transfer documents using my father's name, 9 years after he was already dead." She laid the folder Rami had given her on the table, open, facing the room. "I'm not a businesswoman by training. I'm a chef. I built a catering company from nothing, in a city where I didn't speak the language when I arrived. But I know how to read a contract when somebody hands me one, and I know fraud when I see it laid out in black and white." She looked directly at Lenora. "And I know when somebody's been counting on me, not having the money or the lawyers to fight back." "This is a private business matter," Lenora said, voice tight, trying to reclaim some footing. "This isn't the venue. You made it the venue," Venus said, "when you sent my fiancé to call off our wedding, by text instead of facing me yourself." Somewhere down the table, one of the investors actually laughed. Short, involuntary, the kind of laugh that happens when someone says the thing everyone in the room is thinking. Venus felt the shift in the room before she fully understood it. The power in that hall, the kind that had always belonged to people with more lawyers and more money, was sliding, slowly, toward a woman who'd walked in wearing a dress she chose for herself and carrying nothing but the truth. Fiancé sat very still through all of it, calculating, the way men like him always calculated, weighing what this exposure was about to cost him against what continuing to hide it might cost him instead. He looked at his son, who hadn't sat back down, who was standing beside Venus without saying a word, simply present, simply there. "The merger is suspended," Fiancé said finally, flatly, to the room. Effective immediately. Rami exhaled, quiet relief crossing her face for the first time all night. Lenora stood, gathering whatever dignity she had left, and left the hall without another word, Garrison trailing behind her, sobering up fast in real time as the weight of what he'd just done in front of dozens of witnesses began to land. The dinner didn't end gracefully. Nothing about that night was graceful. But it ended honestly, which was more than Venus had gotten from anyone in this story until now. Out in the hallway afterward, away from the cameras of attention that had been on her all night, Venus finally let her shoulders drop. Jun-chul stood close, not touching her, giving her the space to decide what she needed. "You didn't save me in there," she said. "I wasn't trying to," he said. "I was trying to stand next to you while you did it yourself." That was the difference. She felt it settle into her chest, finally, fully. The difference between a man who steps in front of you and a man who simply refuses to leave your side. "I still need to know you didn't know," she said. "From the beginning. About the land. About all of it." "I didn't," he said. "I've spent 5 days proving it to myself as much as to you. If I'd known, I wouldn't have let it take this long to find out." Venus studied him for a long moment in the quiet hallway, the noise of the dinner still settling behind closed doors, and decided, not blindly, not out of exhaustion, but because she'd watched him choose honesty over his own father, in front of a room full of people who could have ruined him for it, that she believed him. "Okay," she said. "Okay, okay," she said again, softer. "I believe you." The legal aftermath moved faster than Venus expected, mostly because Lenora Voss, faced with public exposure and a folder of evidence, 9 years in the making, had no appetite left for a drawn-out fight. Ines handled the rest with the kind of brisk efficiency Venus had been grateful for since day one. The probate challenge was dropped within a week, the forged documents formally invalidated, and the land, finally, undisputedly, became Venus's, free and clear, no shell companies, no quiet maintenance crews, no strings attached to anyone's last name but her own. Venus drove out to see it alone the day the paperwork cleared, just her, standing at the edge of a vineyard her father bought decades ago, for reasons she'd never fully know, looking out at land that had outlived him, outlived the lie that tried to bury it, and somehow ended up exactly where it was always supposed to go. She cried that day, not the kind of crying she did alone in cars, holding it together for the sake of appearances. The other kind. The kind that comes when something finally, fully resolves, and your body doesn't know what to do with the relief, except let it out. Jun-chul found her there an hour later, having quietly tracked the paperwork's progress himself, and didn't say anything when he saw her face. He just sat down next to her, on the low stone wall at the edge of the property, and let her have her silence for as long as she needed it. "I don't know what I'm going to do with all this land," she admitted finally. "You'll figure it out," he said. "You always do." The weeks after that brought their own quiet reckoning. Jun-chul went back to Seoul once, briefly, for a conversation with his father that he never fully recounted to Venus in detail, only telling her that it ended with his father, for the first time in either of their lives, not getting his way. "He expects me to come back," Jun-chul told her over dinner one night, voice careful. "Take over the next phase of the company eventually, marry someone who makes sense on paper, live the life that's already been planned for me since before I could talk." Venus didn't say anything right away. She'd learned, over the last 2 months, when to let a silence sit instead of rushing to fill it. "And what do you want?" she finally asked. "I want to build something here," he said, "not inherit something there. There's a logistics expansion into Spain. My father's company has been slow walking for years because it's not as glamorous as the bigger mergers. I want to run it myself, from here, build it from the ground, the way you built your business." "That's not the easy choice," Venus said. "No," he agreed. "It's the right one." He made the call to his father, 2 days later, in front of Venus, not because he needed her there, but because he wanted her there, choosing the harder, smaller, realer thing over the larger inheritance that came with strings attached to every part of who he was supposed to become. His father didn't take it well at first. Few men like Seo Hyun-tae ever take losing well. But there was something in Jun-chul's voice on that call, calm, unshaken, the same voice he'd used the night he stood up at that dinner table, that told Venus he wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was informing his father of a decision already made. Venus's catering business, meanwhile, had grown past the point where she could run it out of borrowed kitchens and other people's venues. The land sat there, vineyard and stone buildings and all, practically asking to become something more than just inherited paperwork. "What if I built it here?" Venus said one evening, the idea arriving fully formed, the way good ideas sometimes do. Mid-sentence, mid-thought. "A restaurant, on the land, my father's land." Jun-chul looked at her like the idea made more sense to him than anything else she could have said. "Then build it," he said. It took 4 months to build. Venus oversaw every detail herself, the kitchen layout, the long wooden tables, the small details that made the place feel like hers, instead of like something borrowed from someone else's idea of what a restaurant should look like. Talia flew out twice, just to help and complain about the Spanish heat in equal measure. Jun-chul showed up most evenings after work, sleeves rolled up, doing whatever needed doing, the same way he had that very first night at her pop-up dinner. Except now, there was nothing temporary about it. Opening night arrived on a warm evening, with low light and a small crowd of people who actually mattered to Venus. Not investors, not strangers performing politeness for business reasons. Just people who'd watched her build this with her own hands, and wanted to be there when the doors finally opened for good. Talia raised a glass near the back of the room, already a little emotional, already threatening to cry before anyone had even given a toast. To the woman who got left in a wedding dress and built an entire restaurant instead. Talia said, lifting her glass higher. "Some people get revenge. Venus got a vineyard." The room laughed, warm and easy, and Venus laughed too. The real kind. The kind she hadn't fully felt since the back of a stranger's car months ago, when two people running from the worst days of their lives somehow ended up laughing at the same joke for the first time. Jun-chul found her near the kitchen doorway later that night, plates still in his hands because old habits hadn't fully left him, watching the room fill with the kind of noise that only happens when something good is actually working. "You did this," he said. "We did this," Venus said. "You showed up. That counts for something." "It counts for a lot," he said. She looked out at the room, her restaurant, her father's land, the life she'd built out of the wreckage of a text message that was supposed to break her, and instead ended up clearing a path to something she never would have found any other way. "You know," she said, "if Garrison hadn't sent that text, I never would have gotten in that car. If I hadn't run out of my own engagement," Jun-chul said, "I never would have been in it." "Funny how that works." "Funny," he agreed, "and a little terrifying, if you think about it too long." "I try not to think about it too long," Venus said. "I just try to be grateful it happened the way it did." Outside, the vineyard stretched out under a sky, just starting to turn dark. The same land that had once been a quiet weapon in someone else's plan, now nothing but hers. Hers and the man standing beside her, who hadn't saved her from anything, who'd simply refused to leave while she saved herself. Venus Kane stood in the doorway of the restaurant built on her father's land, laughing at something Talia said from across the room, completely unaware of how far she'd come from the woman standing in a chapel back room, reading a 4-line text message that was supposed to be the end of something. It wasn't the end of anything, it was just the beginning nobody saw coming. Not Venus, not Jun-chul, not a single person in that room who watched two strangers from the wrong car build a life neither of them had planned, but both of them, somehow, had been heading toward all along. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know it hit different. So do me a favor, like this video, drop a comment telling me which part got you the most, and subscribe So you're here for the next story. Because trust me, this channel is just getting started.